Good morning. Thank you for coming today to hear me talk about my favorite subject, Hancock history. I don't know if you guys read the Seacoast Echo, but in every week we have a column in the Seacoast Echo called Hancock History. And one of the subjects that we published in the Seacoast Echo was the history of Pearlington. And for those of you who might like history, the Hancock County has a Hancock County Historical Society. I'm a member of this society. And we publish a newsletter every month with a subject of interest. For example, in March of 2021, we had a short history of antebellum Pearlington. And then in June of 2021, we published an article called An Economic History of Antebellum Hancock County, which in those days was all about the Pearl River and Pearlington, because this is where the action was. And I didn't know this when I came here from New Orleans 18 years ago, but I do now. And in the first half of the 19th century, that would be from 1800 to, say, 1860, Pearlington was the most important commercial port on the Gulf Coast. It was a big deal. So the story of Pearlington and how it got started makes a good subject, particularly if you come to Pearlington and talk to the good people in Pearlington about your ancestors and how they made this place into something special. And it's still special. Anyway, I'm going to start you from the beginning. And from the time that the first explorers came here, you've probably heard of Iberville and Bienville. This Gulf Coast was owned, or it was called colonies, by European countries. In the first third of that century, and we'd call that the 18th century, most of this was owned and originally settled by France. And then in the middle third of that century, it was owned by England. And then in the last third of the century, it was owned by Spain. The area here was mostly full of French people who spoke French, and those were most of the original settlers before 1800. And there weren't many people here. Mobile was a bit of a community, but it didn't work. It was a failed capital for what we'll call the Louisiana colony. And so you know that Bienville decided to make the capital of the French colony New Orleans, and did. And New Orleans did evolve from 1700 to 1800 as a commercial port and a viable marketplace. New Orleans is important to Pearlington because that's who we did business with. But before 1800, there was nothing on the Gulf Coast. It was estimated in 1804 that only 40 families lived on the entire Gulf Coast. And we may not have had that many families here in the Pearl River. And the United States, you know, bought the whole Louisiana colony from France in 1804. But at that time, this place was pretty rough. I heard you mention pirates. Well, we had a lot of pirates around. We had them particularly in Gainesville. Of course, there was no Gainesville then, but that location. And the big shot pirate there was a pirate by the name of Pierre Raymond. He had the nickname of the King of the Honey Island Swamp. And he had a base here in the Pearl River, some boats, and he operated out of the Pearl River and was a cause for this place not having a lot of law and order, because we didn't have a lot of citizens, but people were afraid to live here and to homestead farms here and develop businesses because there was no law and order. Spain owned this river valley at that time, and they were like absentee landlords. Now, fortunately, Pierre was nice to the people who lived in the immediate, so he didn't rob and steal and plunder from the local neighbors. He just went out and did it elsewhere. Bless his heart. Now, Jean Lafitte, he had his operation, which was very similar, over on Barataria Island. And he was operating the same kind of business. And it was a business. And they made a lot of money. But we're not going to talk about pirates today. We're going to talk about the Pearl River Valley. So, the Spanish had given land grants to a few people in the lower Pearl River Valley, our area, call it Hancock County, but these grants were not being utilized or invested in or inhabited, except by a few individuals who turned out to be the forefathers or the builders of this neighborhood, and specifically Pearlington. And we'll go into who these people are and what they did. But something had to change to make this whole picture not so gloomy. And what happened was that after we bought Louisiana from Napoleon, you've heard of the Louisiana Purchase, we persuaded in 1811 President Madison, James Madison, says, look, this whole Gulf Coast, which the Spain says that wasn't part of the Louisiana Purchase, and the United States, yeah, it was. President Madison was persuaded to say, the heck with France, we're taking it, or we're claiming it, or the word they used is, I'm annexing it. And he did. Well, that was critical. Because once we annexed it and were willing to govern it and police it, then law and order of sorts would be here, and people would feel comfortable moving here and starting businesses. Now, my favorite view of history is economic history. I believe that's important for understanding, how did we get here? Why did it work? Why did it not work? It was not working until 1811. And in 1811, the government sent over, as you've probably heard, a Dr. William, Fat Doctor, that's his nickname, Flood, in a boat called a sloop, which was like a gunboat for the Navy in that era, in the Mississippi Sound, which is shallow. And he came to the Pearl River Valley and said, okay, you are now part of the United States of America. So I need a justice of the peace. Well, there weren't that many people who could read and write, frankly, who lived here. There were only a few families on a few grants or farms, or working for people with farms and grants. But there was one educated man, and I know you've heard of him, Simon Favre. And there's a lot written about Simon Favre. He's an interesting fellow. But the important thing was that he was educated, he could read and write, and more educated than that. He was intelligent, he was entrepreneurial, and he was willing to accept the job of justice of the peace. And he actually had been in charge before then. The Spanish had given him the title of commandant. So these land grants that people got on the Pearl River, he certified them or enforced them. So he was the law already. Before that, when the French had it, he was an interpreter of the English, of the Indian language for France. So this was a guy who was capable and clever. He also had a property in Pearlington. He also had another piece up river a bit also. But that's another story. It got the name Favre Report in history, but that's his son that made that piece of land notable. But here in Pearlington, Simon Favre is, I would consider him the founder, if you will, of Pearlington. Now, just because the United States took over didn't mean that automatically things are going to change. In any community, certainly in the United States, you have to do three things to make progress. You have to get people to move in here, and then you have to get some sort of capital moved in, that's banking, investment, and then you have to get merchants in here, people who do business, start stores. You do all that, and we did that here, then a community will prosper, and that's what happened in the time after President Madison annexed the whole Gulf Coast for the United States. But our interest here is in Pearlington. So what did Simon Favre do that was so big a deal? Well, like most entrepreneurs in that era, you had to get your seed money. You just didn't start out as a rich plantation owner and buy yourself a bunch of slaves and equipment and everything else. You had to have some money. So the way you could make money back in 1811 was you got a boat. They called them schooners. This is a boat with two masts. A sloop or catboat has only one mast. A schooner has two masts. It's a bigger boat. It takes 9 sailors to make that boat go from Pearlington to New Orleans. But they did go from Pearlington to New Orleans and then New Orleans back. And all of a sudden, this carrying trade is what it was called, made, for the time, immense profits. And then with the money that they had from the carrying trade, they could then extend their entrepreneurial interest into other things like land, plantations. They could start farming, and they could raise cattle, and they could start businesses. And all of a sudden, Pearlington was beginning to look pretty prosperous, or bigger and better than it was before, when it probably wasn't even really much of a town. So Simon Favre was the first one. He had a bunch of these schooners, and he made lots of money. Another fella who came over here, he actually came from France, but came into Pearlington around 1807 or 18. It was a man named Jean-Baptiste Dobie. And he got a grant on what's called Bayou Cowan, which you know right here. And that's where Oak Harbor suburb is right now. And he set up a shipping dock, bought a bunch of schooners, and that shipping place was called Dobie's Point. And he, like Simon Favre, was transporting goods back and forth, and making lots of money. It's all about the money, particularly in those days. And it may be all about the money today. So anyway, as the decades rolled on, at the mouths of every river on the Gulf Coast, because President Madison annexed the Gulf Coast, you began to see small businesses start. And these are vital to a community. And they were vital to Pearlington. And that took money. And the way you get money when you're going to start a business is you get in your schooner and you go over to New Orleans and you walk into the bank and you say, I want you to lend me some money to build something. And they say, okay. And they lend you the money, then you come back here and you build your little businesses. So what did people build in little towns like Pearlington on the rivers all down the Gulf Coast? Well, they built sawmills, for one. Now these were, back in that day, little bitty sawmills. They're very primitive saws and operation. But they also had cotton gins. And you know that Simon Favre had a cotton mill on his land, and that's why you have a street called the Gin here. And the gin went to the gin. It was right there on the water, and Simon Favre set up a business there, ginning cotton. We'll get into that later. What else might you have in a town like Pearlington? Shipyard. You got all these boats that are everybody, this is how people get around. There was no interstate, there was no railroad, there was nothing like that. You go from here to there, you go by boat. So you had to have boat yards or shipyards. And we did repair boats and build boats, and a shipyard was part of a port. We were a commercial port. And some of the things that we could produce here and all over the South was something called naval stores. And from turpentine and the other resins of the pine trees, we made tar and pitch. And this was a big part of the economy of the whole South, because wooden boats were the only type of boats. There were no to metal boats. But the wooden boats, to to make sure that they didn't leak, they had these substances to line the inside of the boat so it wouldn't leak. That's why they call these products from our pine trees naval stores. In the beginning, we also had to have a tavern in any town. So we had a couple taverns. They did a good business. Another type of business we had here that's worthy of note is a brickyard. In a brickyard, you got to have the right kind of clay. But we had a brickyard. It was called the Bennett and Mort Brickyard. And it was responsible for the bricks that went into Fort Pike. You all know about Fort Pike, and it's right there on the Wrigley. Well, that was built between 1819 and 1826, and we supplied 1/3 of the bricks. And it's funny about those bricks, because I think our bricks were a little more white than the red bricks of places that have more chemical in their clay. But you can find white bricks there and red bricks. Ours are the white bricks, but we provide 1/3 of them. Now we're talking about like 1 million or more bricks. This was a real business here. It was a big deal. Well, by 1819, now that's only 8 years after President Madison annexed the whole Gulf Coast, the town was ready to become a town. Well, the first thing you have to do when you want to be a town is you have to lay down some streets. And so a man named Elihu Carver set up in 1819 the grid, or the diagram, of the streets in Pearlington. And those streets are still here today. So it was a good plan. This lasted 100 years. All right, 200 years, sorry. 200 years. In 1820, a year later, the town government got started or organized, and it was called the Pearlington Company. But that was really City Hall. And the first mayor, but they used the word president, but he was really the mayor, was a man named General George Henry Nixon. So we're getting someplace here. And finally, in 1822, the Mississippi legislature recognized the incorporation of what I'll call the city of Pearlington. So Pearlington now is born, and it has a name, and it has a government, and it's just getting started. Now, I cannot emphasize too much how important trade was for Pearlington. And you might wonder, well, what was all this trade about, really? What were they trading? And you had farmers now coming in to the area, and you had plantations along the Pearl River, and you'd heard the expression maybe sustenance farmers. These are farmers that can make their own food and take care of themselves and don't need anything from city folks. Well, even the most competent farmers did need certain things that they couldn't make themselves. They could make their own biscuits and their own bacon, but they needed certain things. Salt. Now, salt, you say, well, do they have salt and pepper on their steak? Is that what salt? Salt was the major preservative chemical. So let's say you had a hog killing, and you got your bacon, and you got your pork chops, and you made your sausage, and you have your hams. You can't put them into the freezer. We hadn't invented those yet, so we smoked them. But we also would have a barrel of pork in most kitchens. And if you filled the barrel with salt while you were layering in your pork, if it's been smoked, it would keep. So you didn't have to have your pork or your beef or lots of things. So salt was critical. And we did not have salt in this immediate town or even in the Pearl River. And there was salt elsewhere from salt domes that was plentiful. So we get a barrel of salt. Flour. We didn't grow wheat down here. Wheat just didn't work. Wheat works great in Illinois and the Midwest. But they were sending down their flatboats with flour, and so it was coming to New Orleans, and although us true Southerners always prefer cornbread to balloon bread or Hollywood bread, there was a desire and a need for flour in your menu, even for the farmhouse out in the country. So everybody had some flour and enjoyed flour biscuits and such pastries from flour, although you could use corn with cornmeal and grits and things like that. Another thing you need is ammunition, guns, and gunpowder. If you're going to hunt and bring in deer or game as part of your diet, got to have ammunition, guns, and gunpowder. Metal tools. We didn't make any metal tools in the Pearl River Valley, so these would come over on the schooners. Tobacco. The Indians grew tobacco in Hancock County, but the tobacco that was really attractive was actually grown in Louisiana in that period. They stopped growing tobacco around this time, but it was a crop certainly from 1780 to 1800. But if not from Louisiana, we could get tobacco from Virginia. Whiskey, rum, wine, liquors. Now, the farmers of Hancock County have had the distinction of having been able to, over time, in the next 100 years, we had three areas of commerce and productivity. The first third was cattle. The second third was dominated by cotton. And the third third of that century, from 1800 to 1900, was timber or lumber products. And we'll go into that a little deeper later. But I want to talk about another pioneer here and try to draw this picture for you as how an economy gets started and what it's all about. A man who came over here, I think from North Carolina, had the name of Captain Bill Poitevant. Now, you probably heard the name Poitevant before in history. And he also had a bunch of boats and carried on this carrying trade and made a lot of money. And then used it to build a sawmill around 1840 in Gainesville. But it's his son that we want to remember. And his name was Captain John Poitevant. Now, you can see their names were Captain this and Captain that. That's because they spent a lot of time on one of these schooners with usually 9 slaves before the Civil War to take them to New Orleans and to come back. These sailors were the most skilled seamen in the Gulf of Mexico. And after the Civil War, the sailors, the black sailors, became the captains and the pilots of the steamboats because they're the ones who knew how to sail. Captain John Poitevin and his father, Captain Bill Poitevin, they probably knew a lot about sailing, but that's different than actually being the sailor. And these slaves that we had, and at about that time, a third of the population may have been slaves, and they were the skilled working people in the country and in the county. They knew how to do everything, and they were often bought based on what they could do. Now, we talked about what's going on in this town. Timber mills, shipyards, sailing, brickyards, even cotton planting. They were the ones who knew how to do it. It wouldn't have happened if that skill and those skills were carried on after the Civil War, and they became the skilled workers, and still are, by and large. So now we have another entrepreneur named Poitevin, and we'll get into him a little later. But the first big plantation that got here was built by a man named Philippe Sauchet. He came over from the lower Plaquemines Parish area where his family had been doing plantations for 100 years. And he built a nice plantation just 2 miles southeast of Pearlington called Sea Island. And he also grew cotton, and he was an entrepreneur and was into everything. This same plantation, by the time of the Civil War, was owned by a man named J.F.H. Claiborne, and he changed the name to Laurel Wood. And that's a famous plantation you always see pictures of, and he was most successful at growing cotton. The biggest plantation in this area was a plantation in Picayune called the Farr Plantation, F-A-R-R. Whereas most plantations had 15, 25 slave workers, he had 100. But that was the biggest one in Hancock County. Others, particularly by this Sauchet family, did exist scattered throughout the county. But as you know, we started with cotton, and it did not go as well as it did up in what's called the Delta area. The soil there was better. Our soil is sandy. And in the 1850s, many of these plantation owners moved up there and grew the cotton there. We still had a lot of cotton. And the way it worked was, in this period, in the first half of the 19th century, the cotton on the better land upriver, that's up the Pearl River, they put it on boats or rafts, and they bring it down to Pearlington, but it had to be processed. So the way you process it is you put it in a mill, and that grinds it out or gets rid of the seeds or something. This is before the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney, or at least here in this county. But the gin processed the cotton, and then we put it on the schooners and we send it to New Orleans. So all of a sudden, Pearlington and Simon Favre and family are now the middlemen on a major product coming from the Pearl River Valley, cotton. And that's why the gin is such an important part of the story of our city, because another business. Now you're beginning to get the feel here that Pearlington was where it was at. I mean, Bay St. Louis was a sleepy little fishing village. They didn't have anything over there to speak of. Pearlington had all the people. Now I want to talk to you briefly about timber, because timber was a big part of Pearlington after this man, Captain John Poitevin, started a timber mill here. But I'm going to have to get you to the point where he was in the third third of that century. In the middle area of that century, we had what's called the pioneer era in the way of timber. And that's, say, 1840 to 1890. And the problem in being a producer of what we call lumber products, the timber you go out and get the tree. Bring the tree to the sawmill, they cut it up, and then it's lumber. The lumber product is what you put on the boat and you send out to New Orleans or all over the world. And we did do that, but we had to build up the business. And we had to learn more about how to process or take care of the product. And so when we start out, say in 1825, we had 6 mills, but they were little bitty mills, small time operations. The way you would break up the wood is you would take an axe and a wedge and you would split the wood. And then you had hand saws. Well, you didn't get a whole lot of lumber product done when you're doing it all by hand, even if you got a whole bunch of people in there cutting the wood all day long. Then they got a thing called saw pits. And then what you do is you had like a pit, but a longitudinal pit, a trench. One guy got down in the trench. You put the log on a trestle over it. A log under a trestle. You put another sawyer on top. You get what's called a cross-cut saw. You've probably seen them. They're like this. They got the jagged edges on one side. And one's at the top, one's at the bottom, and they start sawing. And they work their way all the way down the log. Well, again, that's better than the old axe and the wedge, but still, the wood was a little better cut, but we're not putting out a whole lot of lumber products. So we needed something more sophisticated. So we came up with water-driven up and down saws. And you would have water that might pour over a wheel, that might turn some equipment, that eventually by belts would be directed to an up and down saw. Now a horse could do that, going around in a circle. But mules also, but water was the best thing in where we were. Again, this up and down, it was called a sash saw, was okay, and it was a little better than the 2 guys, one on top of the log and one on the bottom, but we weren't putting out that much. Finally, the steam engine was invented. It took a long time. And you wonder, why did it take so long for a steam engine to be invented? Because it's a piston that goes into a cylinder, and if You put the steam in there, it pushes the piston up, that turns things around, and that's converted into some sort of energy or up and down mechanics. But the secret to the steam engine is the piston has to fit exactly into the cylinder. It has to be able to go back and forth, but no steam escapes. So the Germans finally invented the fine milling to make a cylinder that could be part of a steam engine, and all of a sudden lots of things changed. For example, steam machines of all kinds, like sawmills, could now have pretty good piston-operated mechanics. They invented a circular saw, and the steam engine would make the circular saw go round and round, and that would cut through the logs, and all of a sudden, okay, we're putting out some product now. We're putting out boatloads of product every day. And we did. Now, a couple things worth mentioning is that by 1870 we had 479 people in Pearlington. Doesn't sound like a lot, but by 1900 we had 1,500 people. Well, that was a lot. And I want to now switch to another area of economy, and that is the planting of food. We've all heard about King Cotton, but up till 1837 in Mississippi, corn was the dominant product of Mississippi. Then cotton became the principal crop. And today, it may be soybeans. So the crop changes depending on what the marketplace requires. These entrepreneurs, some of which I've mentioned about you, they evolved into a socio-economic class of upper echelon citizens that emerged and that was wealthy. Property, that means they had land and slaves, and they owned real estate, and they were entrepreneurs. They started businesses, and as I hope I've persuaded you, having all these different kind of businesses in Pearlington is what made this place go. Well, that steam engine brought steamboats. And around 1840, we started to have regular steamboat traffic. Now, these schooners had been doing the job for over 40 years, but steamboats were even better. And all of a sudden, passengers are coming back and forth. They have regular service every day, and more people come, more people start businesses, and the whole Gulf Coast begins to grow and grow and grow. In this town, the next steam engine invention was the choo-choo train. Trains started the timber business in Hancock County. Once they could transport their trees from the forest into the mill. They used to do it by having them float down the river, but they also needed to carry the product elsewhere. Railroads changed everything, and big sawmills evolved all over. Now, we had little sawmills for 40 years, but now we had big ones. And one of the biggest ones in the world was the one that this Captain John Poitevin and the son of Simon Favre started. Was called the Poitevin and Favre sawmill. And it was big. It was super big. And all of a sudden, this town got bigger and bigger and more prosperous and dominated the neighborhood. Now, there was another sawmill for a while up in Gainesville. And in this period of time in the 19th century, Pearlington and Gainesville competed one against the other as to who was going to be the most prosperous, important town. And it looked like Gainesville was going to be ahead in the 1840s and 1850s, but by the 1860s, Pearlington moved ahead and Gainesville declined, relatively. And of course, now, Gainesville, Napoleon, Santa Rosa, they're all ghost towns. And Pearlington is still here, even if in a much reduced posture than it was in that era. Anyway, I want to repeat one development is that in Hancock County, and I think that certainly goes for the Pearl River Valley, the first third of the century, cattle were our major commercial product. In spite of all that, I've talked to you about other things, cattle was big. Cattle has been the most consecutively prosperous commodity we've ever produced, even till today in agriculture. Cattle is big. Cattle has always been big. In the middle half of this century, the key product was cotton. And cotton was big, particularly 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, even though the cotton began to be reduced in impact after the Civil War. And in the third half of that century, the major product was timber or lumber products. And they took over as the dominant sector of the economy. But even that ended. By 1930, we'd cut all the trees down in Hancock County. And in 1904, the Poitevin and Favre sawmill, which was so important to the economy of Pearlington, moved to Mandeville. They'd cut all the trees around here. So they said, well, let's put the plant up there in Mandeville, and did. Once we lost the sawmills, then we began to lose the one of the driving forces of our economy here in Pearlington. But the worst thing that happened to us and to the whole Pearl River Valley was the railroads. Because boats were the way you transported people and goods until, say, 1870, when we put a railroad between Mobile and New Orleans. And then about 1885, we put a railroad between New Orleans and Picayune and Lumberton. We didn't use boats anymore, and the Pearl River no longer, as Thigpen put in his book, the highway to the promised land. Well, we still had the promised land, but the Pearl River was no longer the highway. And now if you go out on the Pearl River, you don't see a whole lot of boat traffic going on, because that isn't how things are transported. They're transported, as you know, by truck or by train, somewhat by barge, and by even possibly airplanes to a point. So in 1930, the Weston plant in Logtown closed, and basically the Logtown era was over. So I've given you what I hope is an overview of Pearlington. I'm going to mention some of the names now of these families, of this society of entrepreneurs and plantation owners and businessmen and carrying trade, schooner captains and everything. But these are the family names that back in the 19th century were all part of Pearlington society, and then they became the bedrock foundation of Hancock County society, and still are. But the family names that I think I've seen on gravestones in the cemetery, and from what I can read in the history books, are Russ, Poitevant, Favre, Seal, Weston, Graves, Leonard, Daniels, Wingate, Nixon, MacArthur, and Prey. Those family names and those families still live in Hancock County and elsewhere in the Pearl River Valley. But they got us started, and Pearlington got us started, and it was a big deal commercially back in that day. Now I would say it's a sleepy little town, and a beautiful place, but nothing like the commercial port it was back in the first half of the 19th century. Any questions?
Where was the brickyard? You were talking about the brickyard?
They make bricks.
But where was that located?
I don't know. I mean, it was in the city.
Just wondering.
I think I could say it was over there. I think it was more on the south side than the north side. And there's not much left of it.
Are there any areas where some of the brick is still like on the ground where you could see it?
Fort Pike.
Oh, so you
If you can go to Fort Pike, look for the white bricks rather than the red bricks.
If you go up to Logtown, you'll see some of the old foundations still standing. They're back in the woods. White bricks. That's what goes up to them. That's what forms them.
That's what I was thinking.
That's all the Western Sawmill Foundation up there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you been up to the old sawmill foundations?
Yes, but I didn't see anything. I had to get pointed to where it was. It was obviously on the waterfront.
Yeah.
But
about 20 pillars left still up there of the old sawmill.
yeah, and you could drive right out to the edge of the water, as I recall.
Yeah, there's a boat launch there.
Yeah, that's right. So it was a good place to have a sawmill, and at one time that dominated the waterfront. Although there was a lot of other stuff going on the waterfront.
Just north of there was the town of Logtown. There was
Yes.
a community there, school, everything there.
Yes.
And part of it was still there for a long, long time. You could go up there and metal detect around school, kind of the things, around town, in the water, in the slough right there, was all the community stores and merchants were on that small slough in there. And that's where they dealt with it. And you could go to these stores by up the road into the mill or by water. And they dealt both ways.
Yeah. Logtown did grow at one time. As many as 3,000 people. And they closed in around 1930. And then it diminished in size, But there were people living there up till the 1960s when the Stennis Space Center threw them all out.
It's
Said,
still
get out.
It's
Probably was
still
we still living like that somehow.
They didn't want to go. Nobody wanted to go that
Yeah.
were in the towns that were abolished.
Right, right.
That was home, but, they took it away from them.
Yeah,
There's still small private cemeteries up in there,
yes.
have family graves in them.
Well, there's a well-kept cemetery in Logtown, you probably know that, and there's a road to get there that's good, and the Baxter family keeps it up. You all, of course, have your cemetery here. There is a cemetery, Point, I think I got the name of it.
Lindsay Cemetery.
Say it again?
Lindsay,
Lindsay Cemetery.
All right, that's the one.
on Point Road.
That's on Point Road.
Yes, okay. That's a fairly well kept up, nice looking little cemetery. It seems to me there was a mayor that was buried there, or police chief. You got it right?
I don't know.
Prominent person. Then the next one up originally was Napoleon, and they have a cemetery, and you still get to it, and it's pretty well kept up. The next cemetery up was the Gainesville Cemetery. Now that would be in, or was in, the Stennis Space Center. I'll skip that for a minute and go to the next one, which is the Santa Rosa Cemetery, and that's called the Turtle Skin Cemetery. That's there and well kept up. Now to come back to Gainesville, there's this sad story about Gainesville. They didn't want to keep the cemetery in Gainesville in the Space Center. For one thing, is if you have a cemetery there, they cannot prevent you from coming to visit your departed ones. So they interred every grave in that cemetery, and there were a bunch of graves. As I recall, it was like 150 or 200. And they moved them over between I-10 and the Napoleon Cemetery.
Spring Branch.
Yes, it's there, Spring Branch. Unfortunately, nobody took care of it, and the Space Center didn't take care of it. So it got overgrown, and it was unrecognizable 20, 30 years ago as a cemetery. People were hunting around, they'd stumble on top of a tombstone and say, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? But there are a couple descendants of some of the people that were buried there that have taken their effort to clear it and to make it more presentable, and preserve the beauty and sanctity of that graveyard. But I blame the federal government for this.
And the federal government should be maintaining it.
They should be maintaining it. They moved it, and it wasn't. Now, fortunately, we have the names of the people who were buried there when we moved them from one to the other, but half were unmarked graves. Now, that's not the federal government's fault. That in every cemetery there are a certain number of unmarked graves, particularly in the old days.
Is that because they use wood?
Yes, yes. For your information, the Hancock County Historical Society, which I would love to see you guys consider joining, so you can read my articles, has a list of all the cemeteries in the county and everyone who's been buried in the cemetery and their birth and date and where they're located, at least on some of the cemeteries. So that helps me record the dates and get names like the list I gave you of people who were part of the history that we've all a lot of forgotten.
Where did they get their info to compile that? Did they go to look at those tombstones, or do they?
There's a lady that goes to the graveyard. She goes to all different graveyards.
Yeah.
She try to find out where each grave is and who's in that grave. She even leave you a brick out there if you know who's there. and let you put their name on there and the date they was born and the date they died.
Right, so they do physically.
Yeah, they have a lady that was at the graveyard one day, we went out there.
And we cooperate by offering to be one record, call it a permanent record. Anything else? Anything?
No, it's interesting.
Anyone would like to make a comment?
I'm curious about Hancock County's original dimensions and what that encompasses now. What counties? Because Hancock County was a lot bigger early on.
Yes. When President Madison annexed the Gulf Coast, very quickly, this area for just a year or so was called the Biloxi Parish. But in 1812, we citizens in the Pearl River Valley said, no, we do not want to be Biloxi Parish. We want to be Hancock County. So then we were Hancock County of the Mississippi Territory. We weren't a state yet, but we were a county. Now, there weren't that many counties in Mississippi. There weren't that many people in Mississippi. But what they designed for Hancock County was an area that would go all the way to Biloxi and all the way up to include Stone and Pearl River County today. So we were a very big county. But we made a mistake. We made our capital back in 1812, this little town called Caesar today, center then. Now, it really was the center of population, both of the Indians before us and the, we'll call them Americans, Europeans after them. It didn't seem so silly. But it didn't take more than 15 years before everybody said, it's a long ways to go up to, and the roads aren't worth a damn. So they said, all right, we'll make a compromise. We will make the courthouse, which is where you record deeds and lots of stuff, in Pearlington, and Bay St. Louis, they called it then Shieldsboro. And so 6 months of the year, the courthouse would be in Pearlington. 6 months of the year, it would be in Bay St. Louis or Shieldsboro. The capital was, the county seat was still in Center. In 1835, they said, this is crazy going up there into the country. So they made Gainesville the county seat. And then finally, there was a fire in Gainesville. All the records were lost. And the county seat was then moved to Shieldsboro or Bay St. Louis, something like 1870. And it's been there ever since. But that's the background of the county. And now, what I haven't finished the story is, because we had our county seat in Gainesville, all the people in Biloxi and the towns there that were beginning to grow now say it's too far to go all the way to the Pearl River to do our business. And Pearlington, unfortunately, was short-sighted, and they said no. They wouldn't even agree to Shieldsboro or Bay St. Louis as the permanent capital instead of them, and Gainesville. And so everybody threw up their hands in desperation, went to the state legislature, and the state legislature said, all right, we're going to chop up Hancock County into three counties then. So they, in 1841, made Harrison County a separate county. Well, talk about a chunk. That in territory, that took 3/4 of the coastline, much less what we lost up top. Now, we did not lose Pearl River County permanently until about 1895. And we didn't lose Picayune until 1908. So chop, 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 chop. We're a tiny little colony. I mean, a tiny little county. Now, to give you an idea of how tiny we are relative to Harrison County. By the way, that was named after the president, General William Henry Harrison. But anyway, today, if you measure the commercial activity in a county or a city, you call it gross regional product. If you're talking about a nation, it's called gross national product. But every county is measured by the federal government for their gross regional profit. Our county has a gross regional product of something like $1.4 billion. That's not bad. We didn't get there easily. But Harrison County, that has Pass Christian, Long Beach, Gulfport, Biloxi, their gross regional product is $8 billion a year. So they're 8 times more commercial or busy than we are. So we took a hit.
Because of the ports, I guess. The ports, like the ports.
Yes,
Ports.
and the casinos and the activity. I mean, look at Gulfport. You can go up Gulfport and it's just business and everything. And we shouldn't have been so stubborn about where the county seat was. We would, Hancock County would be a lot bigger if we hadn't been so stubborn. But Pearlington had been used to being the center of attention and the golden commercial port, and they just were reluctant to give up the privileges of at least having the courthouse here and the county seat itself in Gainesville so close.
Oh, and then they would have had to go by, what, horses to get to the capital, or how would they? There weren't cars. And the train didn't run through here.
The only way you could do it is back in the day. You took a boat from, say, Biloxi up to, let's say, Gainesville, and then you rented a horse or wagon, or both, and you drove yourself up to Center. Now, if you were just, when Gainesville became the county seat, you could take a boat all the way. If you're going to the courthouse in Shieldsboro for that 6 months, or Pearlington for that 6 months, then you take a boat. But boat is the only way you can go with any speed or convenience before we started building highways, and then of course steamboats, but that's a boat. And then finally the trains changed everything. Once you had this commuter service, then you could get to and fro. But
they didn't want to change it because they didn't want the inconvenience of having to go. It was harder to get to, and they were kingpin. I guess they
right.
They need to come to us.
Yes, and they didn't want it, and eventually they had enough political clout to break up the original Hancock County into smaller counties. But that's a story there. Any other questions?
This was very interesting. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I hope I didn't talk too long and bore you. But although I'm from New Orleans originally, I came here to Hancock County 18 years ago. I am enjoying so much getting the history of the county. And the way I've done it, and I'm still doing it, is I'm going to, there's 16 little towns or neighborhoods in Hancock County. As a matter of fact, when this library system was invented in 1937 by a lady named Louise Crawford, she set up 16 separate libraries. And she got in her car. You really wouldn't call it a bookmobile in those days, but it was. And she would go every month to all 16, and there was one in Pearlington. Now, they weren't buildings, and somebody would have a shed or a part of their house or something like that, but there was books for everybody to read. But there were 16 separate neighborhoods, and I am trying to write articles about the individual history, and it often goes back 200 years, of each of these 16 communities. And I did so in this last year for Pearlington and Ansley and Lakeshore, and I'm going to publish an article on Claremont Harbor. I'm right now driving up to Sellers to visit with a man named Tim Shaw, and his family has Shaw's Famous Fish House, which supposedly has the best catfish in the county, which you get by drift. So I have to get sometimes somebody to tell me somebody, they give me somebody, and then the old families, they all know each other. They've known each other for 200 years, just like your old families here in Pearlington know each other. And that's the way you get to get the real history of the county. And this is what I'm spending my entire life doing now and loving every minute of it. And I enjoy visiting with groups and talking about what I'm doing. And I'd be glad to come back sometime. I go up to the Pearl River County Historical Society every year. Me and my editor, Eddie Coleman, we both go up, and they don't mind. They have adopted Pearlington, by the way. Anything in the Pearl River Valley, they believe is in their area of interest for history. So I gave them this talk last summer, and they enjoyed it, and hearing about you guys here in Pearlington very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Really enjoyed it.